Hello YouTube, this is Thomas Judge back once again, continuing my MCU universe watch through, and I have just finished watching Thor the Dark World. Where to begin? Okay, this is not a good movie. However, this isn't as bad as everyone bags on all the time. And that's something I want to make clear. This is definitely the weakest MCU movie I've seen so far. In my recollection, it's the weakest one out of all of them, but we'll see. It's not good, and it's got its flaws. But I don't just want to sit here just ripping it in the movie and explaining why I didn't like it or why it wasn't good enough. What I'll do, I'll give you a quick run through and then I'm going to talk through really what I think the fundamental narrative problem with the movie is. So let's jump into it. It starts off with a Lord of the Rings style prologue, which I guess kind of fits the epic fantastical theme of it, all the sword and sorcery stuff. Then the film just immediately just kicks off, and apparently they rebuilt the Bifrost, so that wasn't that big a deal from the end of Thor. A bit of scene setting. Jane gets the ether, which, as we know now, is the reality Infinity Stone. It reintroduces the space elves from the prologue and Malekith, and so they've got this like awesome spaceship. All of a sudden, it goes from being fantasy and sword and sorcery to these people with this awesome epic spaceship flying around the spaceways. And actually, it kind of segues together reasonably well. Again, more in keeping with the Guardians of the Galaxy vibe. Um, then you got, I guess, what's the first action beat, which is the spaceships attacking Asgard, the Dark Elf escaping, the death of Thor's mother, the revelation that Asgard actually has anti-aircraft artillery. If they have artillery, if they have munitions, how come all the guards in the palace are using swords when everyone else has guns? You know what? It doesn't matter. Let's not pull threads. Um, then it segues into the second sort of major battle, which is once they've escaped with Loki and they leave Asgard and they try and get the reality stone out of Jane Foster. The interesting thing before that is you can tell this is an attempt by the director of the movie to have like a Mission Impossible style scene, because they're talking about how they leave Asgard, how can they betray Odin, commit treason, should they do it, how do they do it, what are the obstacles they need to overcome. And it's filmed and written kind of like a Mission Impossible scene. Oh, it's much worse than you think. There's this obstacle, and then what happens if this happens? Oh, well, then we'll do this, and then what happens if this happens? But it's a really bad Mission Impossible scene. Not to say that all the Mission Impossible scenes in the Mission Impossible franchise are done very well, but this is definitely a very poor one. And it's an interesting kind of tonal shift for the story itself. It feels more in keeping with something like the later Ant-Man movies. But, whatever, I'll let that slide. Anyway, then you go from battle to battle to battle, and then it segues into the final battle, which is in London, which actually isn't bad. It's better than I remember. A lot of crazy stuff about portals and shifting from world to world. And it did have one of the first laugh-out-loud moments I've had in this entire watch-through here in film 8, which was Thor getting on the tube, which I genuinely don't remember, and I literally cracked up when I saw it. So that was fine. Competent, slightly MacGuffin-y ending, I guess. Kind of hard to believe some of the tech and some of the random stuff they did, but yeah, fine, whatever. And then it ends, and you got the post-credit scene involving, for the first time, the use of the term Infinity Stones, and also a closer segue between the Thor universe and the Guardians of the Galaxy universe. So that's where we are. That was the movie. Competent, average, reasonably forgettable. So why is it so hated, and why was it so non-functional? Well, I've been thinking about it, and I'm going to try and break it down like this, and feel free to skip this if you're not interested in narrative structure or pacing or how this works. I don't want to sound really pretentious or like I'm bragging or anything, but I've got some idea of how narrative works. I mentioned in a previous video about Joseph Campbell's monomyth and the idea of three arc structures and so on and so forth. I've written my own novels, I've studied English literature, I've got a fair grasp of how this works. So I'm just going to try and break it down for you in a sort of simple and straightforward way as I can. For a start, this film is too short. It's 109 minutes long, which would be fine if it was dealing with other topics, but for what it's dealing with here, it just does not work, because whilst being too short, it's also too epic, and the stakes are too high. Within this film, from start to finish, they introduce a universe-ending threat, which apparently is the Ether and apparently the Dark Elves. They don't characterize them anywhere near enough. Like, Malekith is terrible. I mean, one-dimensional, one-note villain, to say the least. I had no interest in him at all. His aesthetic design was weak. And he didn't do anything of really any value or interest at all throughout the entire film. Now, I do gather there's a lot of other scenes that they cut, which they filmed with Malekith, who's played by Christopher Eccleston, which they then cut in terms of pacing to make it a tighter movie. But frankly, I mean, I'm not going to get into this whole kind of release the Snyder Cut kind of motion of maybe it's better if you had all those scenes. My point is that what they had in the finished movie just really made this villain just beyond one dimensional. It's ridiculous. I mean, he's no Thanos, let's be honest. So Malekith sucked, but the whole thing is he was meant to be a super epic villain, and the stakes are meant to be really high. Now, we're not talking about the stakes like in Iron Man 1, where it's Obadiah Stane's trying to get hold of Tony Stark's arc reactor. It's not something like the Incredible Hulk, where it's basically the Hulk and the Abomination beating each other up. No, the stakes here have gone from that kind of scale to the destruction of the entire universe. And if you consider that, that's a massive quantum leap up from even the last film we were looking at, which had major stakes, which was Avengers Assemble, where it was, the whole of New York's going to get destroyed and Earth may get invaded. It's like, okay, those are big stakes. But to leap up from that, to then leap up to the entire universe and reality will be destroyed, it's like, okay, you need to really get us ready for this. I mean, in the end, it took us about 20 movies to get to that point, really, when you look at Infinity War. And trying to do that from start to finish, at the beginning of one movie and then finish it 109 minutes later, it's way too compressed. The stakes are too high, it's too epic. It hasn't got anywhere near enough time to breathe as a story. What this compressed pacing really reminded me of, and I know I've made this comparison before, was Star Trek. And Star Trek, especially like The Next Generation or Voyager or shows like that, because what they would do quite well, and I enjoyed this as a TV show, what they would do quite well is they'd have two-parter TV shows that would be totally epic. The Battle of 359, Scorpion in Voyager, which was amazing. So, those are great two-part episodes within a TV show. And if you put those episodes together, you've got something, give or take, about 100 minutes runtime. And they're epic, and there's loads of scope, and they introduce something at the beginning of it, and then they resolve it at the end of the two-parter. And that's fine. And those kind of work. One, because you haven't got really that high an opinion or that high a expectation for what you get in a TV show. And two, because those tend to fall on the back of what has been several dozen hours of character building in the preceding season or 2 or 3 seasons. So when you have something which is all of a sudden a compressed, really intense, high epic, high stakes thing that's split as a two-parter, normally it's the end of one season and then the first episode in the next season, it kind of works, and it only kind of works. Like, it's good, but I don't know about you, but every time I watch a two-parter like that, I'd always think to myself, man, I wish they'd just gone off and made like a proper movie, made it more high budget, maybe spanned out into a season-length thing, or just allowed it to breathe. I mean, Scorpion, for example, in Star Trek Voyager, a prime example of that. So my point is that if this hadn't been a Thor movie, if this had been a Thor TV show, and you'd had season 1 end with the first half of Dark World, and season 2 start with the second half of Dark World, that would have been in keeping. You would have been like, yeah, that makes sense. Like, okay, I can see they're trying to build in some stakes. It hasn't quite worked. We're going to move on and move past this. It's a bit short, it's a bit abridged, but it's what you expect from a TV show where things have to wrap up within 45-minute loops. And that's what Thor the Dark World feels like. It feels like a TV special that just got carried away. And in that sense, it's not terrible, but what it does have is a really distorted sense of scale, and a really distorted sense of scope, and a really compressed pacing that does not work. And to have a battle like this, and to have what apparently universe-wide stakes like this, at this point in the narrative of the 22 MCU movies, just doesn't work. I mean, if you look at them, you've got Iron Man, you've got Hulk, you've got Iron Man 2, you've got the first Thor, you've got Captain America, the first Avenger. These are all small human scale battles, small human scale events. Even the first Thor was the destroyer robot blowing up a small Mexican town. That was the scale of the stakes. And because you were invested in the individuals on an individual scale, you understood that. And that town mattered. It mattered much more than the universe feels like it matters in this movie. Similarly, in Avengers Assemble, fine, you've got this New York-wide battle, and obviously it's a global threat and so on, but you've spent 5 movies, you've spent the equivalent of about 12 hours building up to it, and getting used to these characters, understanding what the stakes are, the antagonist doesn't have to be built up because you've already had a 2-hour movie building up Loki. So the antagonist is also much more plausible. You're not introducing Loki at the start of Avengers Assemble for the first time ever. Because if you did, that wouldn't have worked as well. In fact, this is a good way of looking at it. Take Avengers Assemble. Imagine you had a brand new villain you'd never seen Loki before. Strip off half an hour of the runtime. Ramp up the stakes massively. So it's not just New York's at danger, but the entire universe is at danger. And then as a result, kind of have the action bleeding from one beat to another. You've already heard me talking about how it's hard to work out where the first, the second, and third beat is in this movie. It's because it all just kind of bleeds in together because of the compressed pacing. Listen, I don't want to bag on this too much. Thor the Dark World was an okay movie. It's not one I would really look at watching again. It wasn't terrible. I can see where it fits in into the MCU. However, I think in retrospect, had they gone back and looked at it again, they would have just picked a different antagonist, a different mechanism for sort of eliciting threat and for having a reason for the narrative. And frankly, whilst it totally makes sense to have a second Thor movie, this is one where almost every part of it was just irrelevant and useless. There we go, guys. Thanks for watching. As always, please like, comment, subscribe. Please let me know what you think of the series. Please let me know what you think of Thor the Dark World. And as always, please support by heading over to Amazon.com and checking out my own episodic prose novel, No Gods or Kings, which is available for free or less than $1. Until next time, tomorrow I'll be watching Captain America 2, The Winter Soldier. So until next time, guys, stay classy.